Hi there, this is John Wilkinson from History Made Easier. I'm taking a look at the key factors to the Paris Peace Treaties. I'm not going to go into detail. You can find that on my website and even more of it in my ebook, which you can find on Amazon. But hopefully this video will help you understand the kind of things you should be thinking about as you prepare for your exam. First of all, there is the nature of the war itself. It was long and it was bloody, costly in lives and in money too, with France and Belgium also suffering severe war damage. The war on the Western Front had been fought on Belgian and French soil, and immense damage had been inflicted on their farms, in their villages and in their towns. Some of it like flooded mines as the Germans retreated. The war had also placed an unprecedented financial burden on Britain and France, and they were both now heavily in debt. Whereas America, and this is not a dig at America, it wasn't their war. But America joined the war late and consequently suffered far fewer losses and actually benefited financially from the war as they supplied the British and French and were now owed huge sums by them, as well as having been in a position to trade with countries Britain and France had traditionally traded with. And there's something else. Something textbooks don't pay enough attention to. Men on the front had seen things that they could never forget. And these men would vote in coming elections, and politicians had to be aware of that, as well as the sacrifices made by the families of men who wouldn't be coming home, or else would do so as casualties of war. As a consequence, the three leaders, all from democratic countries and so aware that votes had to be won, came to Paris with different priorities. President Wilson was the only one of the big three who felt able to step back and take a more considered view. He wanted to reshape the post-war order based on self-determination and democracy, as well as to ensure lasting peace. And the democracy factor is often forgotten when it is vitally important. Wilson, like most liberals, felt peace was better ensured with democracies. He might have been wrong, but that's what he felt. No matter that he felt Germany bore most of the blame, he nevertheless felt all the European powers shared some of the responsibility for the war. Hence his 14 points that included open diplomacy and an end to secret treaties, all to be guaranteed by a League of Nations. You can link this back to the American war experience, and you can link it forward to the fact that Congress and the American people didn't agree with Wilson's noble, idealistic stance. They wanted nothing to do with European affairs. Georges Clement's position was perhaps the most straightforward. He, like all of France, wanted Germany punished and weakened so that France would be made safe. You can link this back, of course, to the damage caused by the war, including the loss of life. But link it back also to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, in which Clemenceau had fought. The war that had united Germany and which had taken Alsace-Lorraine from France in the process. The truth of the matter was that France feared Germany. And you can link this forward to the way that, disappointed with what Clement had achieved at the peace conference, the French didn't elect him in the elections that soon followed. Lloyd George was aware of public pressure to make Germany pay, and he also wanted Germany punished, and he wanted the British Empire protected. But he was also aware that Germany had been a very important trading partner before the war, and trade meant jobs, and he wanted Germany to recover economically. He was also, it's fair to say, like President Wilson, concerned to avoid another war. And in all of this, Lloyd George best represents the compromise that the Treaty of Versailles was. And so you can link it back to the deal that was struck. But you can also link it forward to the appeasement of Hitler. And there was Italy and Japan and Russia to consider, the other countries who had fought too, and also the peoples of the defeated empires. Italy had been promised so much by Britain and France, but Wilson, determined to ensure self-determination, reined their promises back to such an extent that the Italians would refer to the treaties as the mutilated victory, whereas Japan felt it had been treated badly by America and the Europeans, and Japan was unhappy with the whole process. And Russia, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, was not even invited to Paris, treated like a pariah. And in all this, I think it's important to note that Italy and Germany would form the Pact of Steel. Japan, Germany and Italy would form the Anti-Comintern Pact, and Russia would agree to help Germany rearm secretly and join with Germany in the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now the peace conference was held with passions still running high, very high. It was held in Paris, where hatred of Germany was at its most intense, and it was chaired by Clement, who set the tone. The German delegation and those of the other losing powers were not invited to attend the conference. Hence, they saw the treaties as a diktat, which made it easier for them to ignore them wherever possible. In fact, when the German delegation was brought to Paris to receive the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, their train was slowed as it went through the battlefields, so that the Germans could ponder on the damage they had inflicted on France. Also, we should realise that the size of the task was enormous. For example, redrawing the map of Europe. Where to put the borders? How to ensure newly created countries were economically viable? For example, did they have industries? Or could they be given a coastline to more easily import and export goods? What to do to protect minorities within the borders? Such was the scale of the problems that time was needed, but the politicians and diplomats didn't have time. Europe was torn apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was breaking up even before the war had ended, and countries were already announcing their independence. Now, you don't need me to tell you that dealing with the treaties is enough, but of course you might well face questions on the other treaties. I think the key to dealing with this is to appreciate that the key clauses were common to all the treaties, that they were all diktats, that all the defeated countries were required to accept war guilt, that they all suffered territorial losses and they all had to pay reparations, accept military restrictions and a delay before they would be allowed to join the League. I hope this makes it easier for you to revise for those other treaties questions. So don't panic, just try to remember some detail. You won't need too much. Then we come to the reactions to the treaties. The French thought that the Treaty of Versailles wasn't harsh enough, especially as with the American Congress refusing to ratify the treaties and join the League, the Anglo-American guarantee in which America and Britain promised to come to France's aid should Germany ever again threaten it, didn't become a reality. This guarantee had helped to ease French concerns about a German recovery, and it helped them to accept the compromise of the Treaty of Versailles, and now it was worthless. And as Clemenceau had feared, the French people simply did not think the terms were harsh enough, that Germany had been punished enough, and France protected sufficiently. And Clemenceau paid the ultimate price, as within just a few months of the treaty being signed, he was kicked out of office and his political career was over. The British soon thought the treaty was too harsh. German recovery would be affected, and too many of the terms seemed to stand against Wilson's 14 points and an assured peace. Hence, Britain was not happy with the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr in 1923, and Britain was prepared to revise the Treaty of Versailles, with Locarno for example, as well as to allow Hitler to make his revisions. Unease with the Treaty of Versailles was an important factor in appeasement. Not the only factor, but it was an important one. Whereas the American Congress rejected Wilson's vision of the post-war world and certainly rejected the role he thought America should play in it. As I've mentioned, it refused to ratify the treaties and refused to join the League. Instead, it opted for normalcy, which can be crudely translated as meaning let's get back to making money. And to a large extent, this also meant America's isolation from international affairs. As to German reactions, well, universal shock and horror really does best sum them up. They didn't think they were guilty of starting the war, whilst they didn't think they had been defeated either. They had asked for an armistice, based on Wilson's 14 points. The treaty was labelled the Treaty of Shame by Germans, and the right-wing nationalist parties labelled those who had signed it and the armistice the November criminals, claiming Germany had been stabbed in the back. Make use of all of this. It didn't matter that the German government had to accept the treaty's terms, or else even worse punishment would have been inflicted on the German people. Revenge was clearly high on the agenda for the right, and as we saw with Hitler, remained so throughout the life of Weimar. The treaty made it extremely difficult for Weimar democracy to establish itself in Germany, and in truth it never did. There was always a worryingly high percentage of votes in Weimar elections, and goodness there were many of them, for parties opposed to democracy. The events of 1923, the occupation of the Ruhr when Germany was unable to pay its reparations, was understandably linked by Germans back to the treaty, and led to Hitler's first attempt to seize power. It took the Great Depression before Hitler was able to capitalise on this feeling, but it was always there, bubbling away under the surface. And so to reaching judgments on the treaties. You should be ready for the kind of questions you could face, and ready with your responses. The first thing to consider are the guilt clauses. To what extent were the defeated powers alone guilty? And this should include the way the war was fought as well as the causes of the war. Or should the winners look at the part they played too? Should Wilson have taken a stronger line? The treaties were seen as both too harsh and not harsh enough. How could this be so? Indeed, was the compromise the most costly mistake made in Paris? You need to have evidence ready to support all viewpoints. Were they good or bad treaties? Were they wise? The key here, I think, is whether the treaties made war less likely or more likely. Now, as I've just said, the Great Depression was a big factor in the Nazis' rise to power, but the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and their government's acceptance of them had never been forgotten by the German people. It helped them to accept Nazism and to accept a Second World War. If the peacemakers got things wrong, what were their most important mistakes? You need to think about that, make your decision and prepare your justification for it. For me, and again it's something the textbooks don't emphasise, I think it's the loss of territory combined with the reparations that made the treaties too harsh. Making Germany pay a fine, which essentially is what the reparations were, whilst reducing its capacity to do so. Removing the territory meant removing farms, removing factories and mines, and removing people. And people were taxpayers, people were workers, people were consumers. Saying they were justified at the time is different than saying they can still be justified with hindsight. Why? Well, justified at the time takes account of the context of the time, the nature of the war, and the fact that this was the second time Germany had gone to war with France. Justified with hindsight means that we are aware of Weimar's struggles, aware of the rise of Hitler, and aware of World War II. And so you can consider whether either the compromise was too great, that the treaties weren't harsh enough, or that the treaties were simply too harsh. So, I hope this has been useful for you, that it helps you to set your thinking on the right paths. I do wish you good luck in your exams. I really do hope you get the best possible grade. And I do remind you that maybe my website, History Made Easier, might also help you get those grades. But for now, I do thank you for listening. Cheers.